Dr. Grant Searchfield, who is the director of the University of Auckland Hearing and Tinnitus Clinic, and is also the director of the Deputy Director of Eistelmoor Research Center for Hearing and Balance. So Grant got a master's in audiology from Auckland and then a doctorate in audiology in 2004, also from Auckland. He's been the inaugural director of the Hearing and Tinnitus Clinic since 2001. He served as the head of audiology between 2007 and 2014 and is a principal investigator at the Centre for Brain Research as well as Brain Research New Zealand. So his research focuses primarily on tinnitus, on methods for clinical assessment and management of the problem. But he also works on the neurological basis of multisensory perception and accessible hearing technologies. So in addition to all this, Grant is also the scientific director for Tinnitus Tunes, which is an internet-based tinnitus treatment resource for patients and clinicians. We just went onto the website and some of the brain training sounds are quite interesting.
So I'll also touch on some of that today.
Yeah. So we'll hear all about that.
Great, thank you very much. I'm not an engineer, but what I do is heavily reliant on engineering. And so in many respects you can consider me an engineer wannabe. And some of the things that I'm going to talk about today are really based on clinical experience and our attempts to try and engineer a solution to tinnitus, which is the sound of sounds in the head or ears. And this is something that we presume has existed as long as humans have had ears and could hear and then could report them. And it's highly prevalent within the population. So we have reasonable health statistics for New Zealand looking at tinnitus prevalence. In the general population, it's around about 6%, slightly higher in males than females, which probably reflects greater noise exposure in a workplace. It increases to over 13% in over 65s, which again probably reflects its underlying point of ignition, which I'm going to be talking about in a moment, which is with changes to the ear. It's pretty indiscriminatory as far as salary is concerned. Prevalence is slightly higher in Wellington. We put that down to all the politicians. And its prevalence is slightly lower in Auckland, which is intriguing, and it probably relates to the various cultures that we have in the city, because when we look at prevalence amongst Maori as an example, it's actually a lot lower than in New Zealand Europeans, which is odd for a health statistic, where normally Maori are overrepresented. We don't know why that occurs. It may be more cultural than genetic, however. I'm going to touch a little bit about that in a moment. So what I wanted to do is to give this talk a little bit of structure and talk a little bit about some of the experimental observations that we have, clinical observations that we have about tinnitus. Then, for those that are interested in modelling, try and capture your interest by talking about where we are at in the evolution of models of this phantom perception. Then I'm going to give you an overview of some of the treatments that have been tried, and some of which have been successful before, looking at sound and other sensory-based therapies, which at the moment are the most effective means for changing the underlying sound that a person hears. So tinnitus is often thought as an auditory analogue for phantom pain. Right? It's a sound that does not exist in our environment, heard either in the ears or ear or in the head. Interestingly, some people can actually localise it to a point in space quite consistently outside of the head that they actually perceive it in. It can be any type of sound. Typically it's called ringing in the ears, but actually very few people report a ringing sound. Whistles are common, cicadas are very common, and often it's not a problem until the person actually realises that it's not an external sound, it's actually an internal sound. For example, a person that we saw in the clinic was convinced that there was a cicada following him around the house. It was summertime, didn't seem to be too bothered, so he sort of got on with life. As it moved into winter, he became a little bit concerned that the cicada was still there. It was only when he was out fishing in the middle of Hauraki Gulf and the cicada was still there that actually came to the realisation of what it was. And it was only really at that point that it became a problem. Likewise, there are people that come into a clinic who said they've had it for years, but they went and saw their doctor and it was given this name and all of a sudden it became a problem. And that probably relates to a certain extent of the unreality of tinnitus, in that most sounds that we hear, in fact all sounds that we normally hear, will have an external auditory object causing them. And we can relate to that. For example, there's the slight fan sound from the projector here, and now when I move around my environment, I know it's coming from learned experience. As I move further away, it gets quieter. When I move my head, I get some identification, localization that that sound is there. Furthermore, if I wanted to, I could go up and touch it. I could feel the vibration, very real. I could possibly smell a slight electronic smell. If I wanted to, I could lick it and taste it and realise it tastes like a projector. But something that's very real. Unlike tinnitus, which has the auditory perception, but nothing else. And it goes with a person wherever they are, and it's very unrelenting. So just some experimental observations in general. Now, what we know is that most people that develop tinnitus will have some form of sensory neural hearing loss. So that's damage to the inner ear or cochlear. Now there are a number of structures within this organ that can be damaged by noise exposure, by acoustic trauma in the form of explosions and so on, or change with age. Some of these the hearing cells, the hair cells, we also have auditory nerves. These can degenerate. They can go through a very traumatic process called excitation, and basically we can have a situation where the hearing nerve can become so excited that it bursts and dies, leaving areas of gaps in the information coming from the inner ear going through to the brain. Of known causes of tinnitus, around 40% are known to be caused by noise-induced injury of some form or acoustic trauma. In 2011, Veterans Affairs spent $1 billion in compensation for the US military for tinnitus. It's the number one service-related injury for military personnel returning from Iraq and Afghanistan. What we also know is that the sound that the person hears, if you like, the spectrum of tinnitus is almost like the reverse or mirror image of the hearing test results. So here we've got some graphs representing three groups of individuals with different spectra related to their audiogram. So here we've got low frequency sounds, here we've got high frequency sounds. As we move down the page, it indicates that the sound needs to be louder before the person will actually hear it. So this is these people here all have high frequency hearing losses. The spectrum of tinnitus is represented by what is resembles to a certain extent the mirror image in that the sound reflects the area of damage in the inner ear. Now this all suggests that the inner ear, the cochlear, is really where tinnitus is at. We do know, for example, that the auditory pathways must be involved in some extent, because when looking at auditory evoked potentials measured when we are going through what we call a streaming paradigm of two tones, we have an A tone and a B tone. When they're grouped together like this, people will normally perceive the sound as being the same. They don't hear two separate sounds. It sounds like the same sound grouped together. When the frequencies of sounds become separated, then individuals will hear these as two separate sounds. When we measure this streaming using evoked potential, auditory evoked potentials and controls, what we find is that we get a stronger negative response here when we have a separation between the A and the B tones. And this is because the deviant tones, these B ones here, draw attention to the signal, and so there is an enhanced negative waveform response. But when there is very little difference between the tones, then we don't get much response. However, in the case of tinnitus, where the sounds fall very close to the primary pitch of the individual's tinnitus, we don't see this growth in the waveform. Instead, the waveform is already of quite high amplitude, which suggests in some respects that the attention that is created by tinnitus being present actually disrupts the streaming process, and that attention is already drawn to the signal complex. So we have a situation where we've got injury to the ear, information coming from the ear would seem to be the cause of tinnitus. However, if the auditory nerve is actually cut, the concept here being that you are removing the source of the signal from the processing in the brain, tinnitus remains. And in fact, in many people, it will become worse. Here you've removed the ability for the individual to hear at all, and your belief is that if tinnitus is created within the inner ear by cutting the auditory nerve, the tinnitus should stop. But it continues. And other attempts to modify inner ear function by chemically ablating the ear or manipulating it with drugs have largely been unsuccessful in changing the tinnitus. So something else must be occurring within the development of tinnitus. So if we actually measure from a single electrode recordings from within the auditory nerve in response to injuries that are known to cause tinnitus in humans, what we see is a reduction in spontaneous nerve activity. This is because the inner ear and the nerve fibres are damaged. There's less driven activity, but there's also a reduction in spontaneous activity. However, if you go up to the next processing station within the brainstem, which is the cochlear nucleus, you see a change. Here we've got a recording from a cat. This is normal spontaneous activity from the cochlear nucleus. This is from an animal that is being deafened. And there's actually an increase in spontaneous activity from the cochlear nucleus. And this is believed to be one potential marker for increased activity related to the perception of tinnitus. Also, we know that the auditory cortex, the temporal lobe, is more activated when a person experiences tinnitus, and this perhaps makes common sense. If we're hearing a sound, the auditory cortex will be active. It's been a very difficult thing to actually show in humans because of the difficulty in turning tinnitus on and off. Essentially, we want a signal where we can turn it on and off, because group differences are so great between people that have tinnitus and people that don't. You have to have very large sample sizes in order to identify any differences. But there are some people that can turn their tinnitus on and off. And they can do this by some form of somatosensory activation, typically by either extending their jaw, pushing their forehead hard into their hand, or tucking their chin into their chest. And in doing that, their tinnitus can go off for a period of time and then release it. There's actually a patent, which is probably from an engineer, consisting of what looks like a colander with large dials, and a person can actually extend pressure onto their head in an attempt to maintain the pressure on the head. These individuals have another form of somatosensory tinnitus, and this is gaze-evoked tinnitus. They can control it by movement of their eyes. So by maintaining gaze at a fixed object while in the scanner and then moving their eyes, they can turn their tinnitus on and off. And so we're able, on this work, to actually record the scans before and after. And what we see in PET scans is activation of the auditory cortex. We also know grossly there are differences in the EEG from individuals with tinnitus compared to without. This is in the delta band of the EEG. And while it is fairly variable, there is a trend for greater EEG activity in these particular frequencies of EEG. But as a whole, from a whole brain perspective, it's not particularly useful. However, both through EEG and through use of resting state MRI, we are beginning to broaden our perspective of tinnitus away from originally what was an ear problem through to what became an auditory pathway problem, to something now that we realise is much more of a network problem. So this is a cartoon of a group of individuals with tinnitus and a control group in the resting state, trying to illustrate that a number of regions of the brain co-activate with auditory activation. And if we have a look at that, what we actually find is that there is a stronger relationship between the auditory cortex and regions of the brain, including somatosensory cortex, prefrontal cortex, regions of the brain associated with memory. What's not shown in this figure here is a disassociation with the visual cortex, like there is a disconnect in the way that we would normally process an auditory signal relative to visual confirmation of that object. So from these models, and we still don't have an objective means of taking one individual and being able to say that they do or do not have tinnitus. Currently we are reliant in experimental studies looking at groups and being able to tell the difference on the basis of history and then confirming changes in physiology. The development and the understanding that tinnitus is much more than an auditory phenomenon and is related heavily to emotion, involvement of depression and anxiety, has largely come through clinical observations. And one of the first widely accepted clinical models of tinnitus was this from 1990, which became known as the neurophysiological model of tinnitus, primarily because before then the focus was very much just on the ear. And essentially what this says is that although the initial ignition point or source of the tinnitus may be from peripheral injury, it only becomes a problem because of involvement of other parts of the brain involved in reaction and emotion, such as the autonomic nervous system and the limbic system. Many people that have tinnitus are not bothered by it at all. A few people have it severe enough that it will actually affect their enjoyment of life, and it's very rare, but it can occur where people describe tinnitus as the reason for self-harm or attempted suicide. In cases like that, the involvement of non-auditory centres in the ultimate perception and reaction to tinnitus is very strong. Also heavily involved is attention and matching, if you like, the perception of what we expect from a sound to existing templates and predictions of what a sound is supposed to, how it's supposed to behave. And this model of attention was developed really to explain some of the clinical results that we were getting with a particular type of auditory training, which I'm going to describe in a moment. Each of these models becomes slightly more complicated. This model from Rauschecker in the States essentially says that not only does emotion determine the reaction to tinnitus, it actually determines whether tinnitus is there or not through a gating mechanism by activation of various thalamic nuclei. So we have a situation in which we have a noise cancelling system existing between the cochlear, the auditory periphery and brainstem, and regions of the brain essentially making decisions about whether they're going to pay attention and react to tinnitus. And this gating mechanism will normally be fine, but if an injury coincides with a traumatic event, as is the case, of course, in military situations where there's not only a loud sound that's potentially causing damage, but also there is the potential trauma associated with seeing someone that you know quite well severely injured. That combination there essentially ungates the auditory system, and then tinnitus persists. When we look at the MRI and EEG studies, it begins to see this complexity and the involvement essentially of the whole brain in perception of tinnitus. And this is not too unlike what you would see within a person experiencing music. As an example, it has both an auditory aspect but also an emotional aspect, also a somatosensory aspect involved with foot tapping in response to music, and memory, and so on. And the model suggests that there is an auditory core which consists of the prefrontal cortex, parahippocampus, and parietal lobes, and the auditory cortex working in together, but there are these other aspects of the brain that can essentially collide and interact with this tinnitus core to determine its effect on the individual. And whether tinnitus is merely an auditory perception that might be mildly annoying but is not really a problem, to something that's quite catastrophic and is having a severe impact on quality of life. Now, I put this diagram in mainly because I thought it might appeal to engineers, because there's lots of triangles with decision axes and sums and lines and then lines going off in one direction and dotted lines and so on. This is essentially one group's attempt to pull many of the aspects of the simpler models into something that can potentially be modelled to a greater extent, where you can perturb one aspect of the system and determine whether tinnitus will arise or not. At the top is what is called decompensated tinnitus. This is the sound of tinnitus without the emotional aspect associated with it. And down here, we've got involvement of other regions of the brain looking to modify and ungate the perception of tinnitus so that it persists and does not habituate. Because normally in our environment, if there is a sound that doesn't particularly interest us, we become used to it. It's said that rabbits living at the end of an airport runway don't notice aircraft taking off, all right? And the reasons are that they've learnt aircraft don't eat us, all right? They don't chase us and they don't mate with us, so we're really not interested in them. But it's a very loud sound. And this sort of explains what can happen. A person can experience the same sound, as far as we can tell by matching it with external sounds. One person will be bothered by it, another person doesn't. It can even come down to a religious or cultural perspective, because there are some groups that believe that, as far as we can understand, when they perceive a sound that we perceive as being tinnitus, they are in fact blessed, all right? They're perceiving a deity essentially talking to them. And for them, hey, if God's talking to me, this is a good thing, it's not a problem. At the other end of the scale, we've seen people in a clinic who have actually undergone exorcisms to try and rid them of the negative connotation. And so depending on your view of what this sound is going to determine how it actually is perceived. I didn't really want to talk about the diagram because I don't really understand it. That's my non-engineer aspect. I thought I'd start out with some treatments now. So these are some oldies but goodies. This is what happens up in the medical school, I think. Fumigation of the ears by urine of ox with vinegar and myrrh. The vinegar and myrrh is probably to take away some of the smell of the urine of ox, I think. We also have had various treatments, opening the skull up to let out the evil vapours of the tinnitus. It's really good if the local area health boards introduce such a treatment, the number of cases of tinnitus dramatically falls. Okay, so it's very effective in reducing the prevalence of tinnitus in the population. Cupping, which is of course what Sonny Bill Williams does on his back to recover from injuries, have also been used for tinnitus. Anybody from Wales? No Welsh here? Okay, probably it's okay, I can survive then. So this is from our Welsh friends, from a well-known Welsh medical manuscript. So take a loaf of bread, divide, produce perspiration, and by the help of God, which is probably how it works, you will be cured. Some things that you can still do today, you can go to some pharmacies and buy air candles. And this involves taking a candle, lighting it, and sticking it in your ear. And that's what it does. The concept is that it sucks out, in some way, some nasties that are potentially causing tinnitus. It's usually demonstrated as being very effective in removing earwax. Because once you've burnt it and you open it up, there is brown wax in the candle. But you're all engineers, I'm sure that you understand that most candles contain wax. And in fact, these air candles contain brown wax, so it's not too surprising that when you burn them that there might be wax here. This is a modern equivalent. So this is a laser that you can buy online for, I think, around about $700. Hook it on your ear, and by stimulating the inner ear with the laser, this is supposed to assist in reducing tinnitus from a mechanism that I'm not too clear about. There is a very strong placebo effect with tinnitus. And we see it through our trials, which makes life very difficult from a research perspective. But it also means that there are many treatments out there that have a modicum of success because of the way that they are bundled and the claims that are made around those. Likewise, you can go online and buy various concoctions that are supposed to assist with tinnitus. At this particular point in time, there are no prescription medicines for tinnitus. Some medicines are used off prescription, and they're primarily used not to really target the tinnitus, but rather the reaction to it. So antidepressants, anti-anxiolytics are particularly used. There are drugs under trial that are selective glutamate antagonists that are designed to change output from the inner ear, but that already raises some concerns that unless you're able to provide the medication within a very acute phase, that the signal may already be established within the auditory pathways. So getting on to other treatments that have a stronger scientific basis, but at times not been successful as well. We have direct electrical stimulation of the brain by implanted electrodes. One of the pioneers of this work in tinnitus is Dirk de Ridder, who is now head of neurosurgery down at the University of Otago. It's based on identifying areas of hyperactivity using EEG and then placing in electrodes into those regions, providing electrical stimulation, and in some individuals that does lead to a fairly long-lasting suppression of the tinnitus. In some cases, however, the areas of hyperactivity actually move and would require movement of the electrodes. And of course, this is not something that you do every week when it comes to having brain surgery. So attempts have been made to try and do this non-invasively. Transcranial magnetic stimulation has been tried, various parameters, various types of magnets, and the success rate is very low and any effects are very short-lasting. So it may be useful as a research tool to temporarily suppress tinnitus, but its usefulness as a clinical mechanism is very low. We haven't used magnetic stimulation, but we have undertaken transcranial direct current stimulation, and again, very similar results. We can get brief suppression of the tinnitus, but in almost no one would this last overnight. So the maximum that we would get would be a reduction of a couple of hours. And here we're providing a very low level current, right? This is, that battery back there was not your car battery, and we're not applying jumper leads to the head. It's a very low level current. And we've moved away from using these large pad electrodes, which when modelled essentially stimulate the brain rather indiscriminately, through to what's called high definition transcranial direct current stimulation, which is more precise in its stimulation. But it's important to understand here that even in the modelling, the depth of the stimulation is not great. So it's essentially on the surface of the brain that any electrical changes can occur. Whether it's positive or negative stimulation, whether it's bursting or steady, it doesn't seem to create a lot of difference. Right? There's variability in studies that have been shown, but it is not very long lasting and an interesting method, but we're really moving away from that because its effects are so short lasting. There can be a strong effect of sound on tinnitus, and this is perhaps not surprising given that tinnitus is an auditory perception. We know that people who experience tinnitus are most often bothered when they're in a quiet environment, and typically this is at night time when they're trying to sleep and there's very little demand on their cognitive resources to pay attention to anything else. So it becomes the one sensory input that they are actually paying attention to. We know from studies undertaken in the 1950s in New York that if you take a large group of university students who don't have a hearing loss, who don't have tinnitus, if you put them in a soundproof room, an anechoic chamber, you give them a piece of paper and ask them to write all the sounds that they hear down, right? Close to 99% will hear some sort of sound. And those sounds that they hear are very similar to the tinnitus sounds. They hear whistles, ringing, cicadas. So, some sense, when a person is experiencing tinnitus, it's along the continuum of normal perception. It just actually arises that they can hear it in other sound environments. So this is a quote attributed to Aristotle, and it's a pretty good quote. Why is buzzing in the ears cease if one makes a sound? Is it because a greater sound drives out the less? This is a concept that if you have tinnitus and you play another sound, what we call masking, the other sound obscures the tinnitus, and as long as the sound that you are playing is more pleasant than the tinnitus sound, then that's a great thing. Out of interest, historians are not actually sure that Aristotle said that, because apparently there are a lot of Aristotle impersonators, and there are a lot of quotes out there attributed to Aristotle which actually were from some of his other cousins. Tinnitus. There's a movie out now that's getting a lot of positive press, which is called Baby Driver, and the main character, and this is a modern day musical because the soundtrack and the action in this movie is choreographed as the sound that Baby Driver hears through his headphones. The reason why he's wearing headphones is because he uses sound to drown out his tinnitus that he got in a car crash with his parents. And so this movie is based around that. And sound therapy, using some sound to actually interfere with tinnitus, is widespread. And we use the term sound therapy as really a catch-all for any use of sound to try and obtain relief from tinnitus. But the underlying perceived mechanisms of effect are very different. This line at the top here is intended to represent a hearing loss. In this case, it's inverted from that graph that I showed you before, and that this person has poorer hearing in this region here, in this frequency region. So they have a high frequency hearing loss, which is very typical for a person with tinnitus. We have different stimulations based on the premise that tinnitus is actually created, the pitch of tinnitus is related to the edge of hearing loss, or is based within the main region of hearing loss. In the case of these therapies, pattern tones are used to try and reorganize the tonotopic representation of sound within the brain. In one case, that's also tied in with vagal nerve stimulation, because vagal nerve stimulation is going to potentially, in certain animal studies of tinnitus, enhance plasticity. Basically, using the vagal nerve stimulation to get the brain into a situation where the tonal stimulation is going to change the brain at a faster rate than normal learning experience would enable. Then we have a therapy which is based on lateral inhibition. The idea here is typically music is played and a notch is created within the music spectrum centered around the tinnitus pitch, with the idea that these edges of stimulation actually have a lateral inhibition effect on the underlying tonal tinnitus. We have another technique which tries to disrupt synchrony within the auditory cortex, which is again proposed to be the underlying basis of tinnitus perception. And there, a series of pattern tones around the tinnitus pitch are played in a manner that is designed to disrupt synchrony. It was originally developed as an electrical stimulation paradigm, I think, for Parkinson's disease, but then essentially changed into an auditory configuration. The most common way of actually reducing tinnitus, is also perhaps the simplest, is simply to try and restore auditory input to more normal levels. This is not fully possible because when we are dealing with the damaged ear, we are often having a situation where auditory nerve fibres are also damaged, and so consequently, even if you provide stimulation, the pathway to the brain does not exist to allow that transmission. But if we start out just having a look at this in a moment, and this is an area that my group have been quite active in, is the use of hearing aids. Most people, if they have good low frequency hearing, good low frequency hearing, poor high frequency hearing, if they are fitted with hearing aids, their tinnitus will be suppressed while they are wearing hearing aids. Over 6 to 12 months, there is a process that seems to develop through a mechanism which we're unsure of, but may relate to very simple learning such as habituation, or may relate to some cortical reorganisation and sprouting of synapses and so on. The tinnitus can be suppressed even without the auditory stimulation going on. I suppose from a non-engineering perspective of what's going here that might be interesting is that the way that hearing aids are becoming much more connected. So as well as the hearing aids acting as a binaural unit in that they don't act independently anymore. If the sound comes into the right hearing aid, the left hearing aid will change its algorithm to try and compensate for the fact that the head is in the way and things like that. So they work as a binaural unit. Also, they can directly stream sounds from the phone and be controlled by the phone. So this essentially has enabled all sorts of different sounds to be created relatively easily and then end up on the user's phone that they can implement as a form of tinnitus treatment. We have a look at some results. This is a study that we did with a group in Australia. When people put their hearing aids on, if they could not hear their tinnitus when they put their hearing aids on, the effect over 6 to 12 months is represented by this green line. This scale here is a measure of tinnitus-related quality of life. So their quality of life improved. It's a smaller effect of tinnitus and quality of life. If when they put their hearing aids on, they became less aware of the tinnitus, we got an intermediate effect. And if they put the hearing aids on, but there was no effect on their tinnitus at all, their quality of life did not improve. Why this is important is because it was assumed that the benefit on tinnitus was simply by improving communication and improving your quality of life by hearing better. But this actually suggests that an important factor in changing the effect of quality of life related tinnitus is actually through an auditory mechanism rather than a psychosocial improvement. We see this in another study with an Italian group looking over 3 months, 6 months. What's initially seen is a reduction in perceived intensity of tinnitus, and then we see, if you like, psychological benefits where the annoyance of the tinnitus and quality of life improves over time. We've actually just completed a study where we're beginning to suspect that we don't actually get this continued decline, that possibly we're actually going to see an effect where tinnitus increases again over a period of time after the auditory stimulation. So just a study that's part way through. This is the device that's used for the patterned stimulation. Won a German Innovation Award, is reasonably well established in the UK as an example. There are very few clinical trials on this. However, one unpublished clinical trial showed that it had no effect above normal sound masking. All right? So having a pattern of sound did not seem to change response. This is an example of the notch music. We have a music spectrum, and then a notch is applied to that to try and achieve lateral inhibition. One of the problems with notching music is that music typically does not have a lot of high frequency energy. And so if you try and notch that, typically in a person's preferred piece of music, really there's very little thing to notch there at all. This also, although available quite widely and widely used, has had no large-scale clinical trials. Something that we've tried developing is a spatial masking technique. And the idea here is that, as I mentioned, most people will hear tinnitus as an auditory object somewhere within the near field of the head. Typically inside the head, but maybe near the surface of the head. And typically when masking sounds are provided, a sound is played to the right ear and to the left ear without any consideration of where the individual perceives tinnitus. And so we've developed a technique that essentially moves the combined perception from a central position using head-related transfer functions to cover the tinnitus. The benefits are that a lower level of sound is required to actually interfere with the tinnitus, and lower level sounds are generally more preferred. There are individuals that actually prefer the other setting as well, but in general, around about 60-70% of people will prefer the spatial. Now, one thing that is happening within the hearing aid field, if you like, disruptive to traditional pathways for fitting hearing aids and traditional hearing aid processes, is the development of wearables. Okay, in this case, hearables, which are equivalent of Fitbit, but they're worn in the ear. So you can answer your phone with them. All right, you can stream your music to them. You can, in this case here, you can go swimming and still listen to your music because they're waterproof. But what's probably most interesting, and for anybody that's interested in sensors, is that these also contain sensors to enable measurement of heart rate, acceleration, and so on, very much like the Fitbit type of device does. Now that's kind of cool because then we can potentially monitor some physiological markers for tinnitus distress, and then from a research perspective be able to follow those, but potentially from a treatment perspective then have the sound therapy automatically modify its response according to the physiological state of the individual. In a very simple perspective there, we're thinking about being stressed and being relaxed. So heart rate goes up, potentially using relaxing music to try and calm the person down, and that would have effects. But there are other avenues for this. The hearing aid manufacturers have realised that this is very disruptive because they begin to enter into commercial relationships. We've also trialled very simple games for tinnitus training. You probably recognise this top one. This is Tetris, the falling block game. All right. This is actually a blank screen. I'll just explain what the game involved in a moment. Tetris was used as a control. It didn't have any sound in this example. It was just given so people could be active in the same similar task to what we asked people to do. Essentially, in the game environment, the person had to use auditory cues to navigate their way around the simple matrix here. When they moved towards the sound, it became louder. If it was to the right and they moved to the right, it became louder, and so on. Essentially, what we were trying to create is a situation where we were rewarding people for listening to sounds that were not their tinnitus. And if they listened to sounds that we created that resembled their tinnitus in the game environment, they were punished for it. So this is a classical conditioning paradigm. All right? The idea, what we're trying to train people to do is to ignore their tinnitus. We can't tell people just ignore your tinnitus because they'll pay attention to it. But can we make them pay better attention to other sounds? This was a 3-week trial with the game that we called Terrain. The storyline that went with it, they had to move around the environment and find targets, and they got a reward for that versus Tetris. These changes in the questionnaire here over 3 weeks are the equivalent that we're seeing with hearing aids over 6 months. And that is encouraging. We don't know how long it lasts and whether it needs to be topped up and so on, but we don't normally see such changes with tinnitus. And this is probably because of the active nature of the task and also the reward and punishment aspect of it. We have engaged with a company that are making an app for this. So our plain screen has just been replaced by various characters that navigate around the environment, and we need to be able to do this to make it more acceptable for users to actually trial and persist with the game that we were doing. We've also integrated other sensory stimulation, including tactile stimulation, to try and draw attention away from the tinnitus ear in the case of unilateral tinnitus, or in an opposite paradigm to try and make tinnitus seem more real. So in these tasks, people are presented with a sound at the same position as their tinnitus, and then they see a flash on the screen and they receive a vibration near their ear, and either a grouping paradigm, where we're hoping for them to perceive the tinnitus sensation, the avatar that we've created for tinnitus, as being more real, or the opposite situation where we're trying to draw the attention away from tinnitus side to perceptions on the other hemisphere. Again, we're seeing positive effects of the training overall, but we're not actually seeing any differences between the integration or attention diversion paradigms. A logical extension of the approach where we're providing different sensory stimulation is to actually use virtual reality. People are probably aware that virtual reality and cognitive behavioural therapy have been used for overcoming phobias by essentially immersing the individual in an environment and seeing spiders walk over their hands and so on. The way that this has been applied by a group in Paris is essentially to try and create such a strong pairing between the virtual tinnitus, which has an image in space that is paired with an auditory replica. So when they move the wand, the sound moves with the image. They're trying to create such a strong binding of the tinnitus with the virtual environment, with the idea that an individual could put the wand down on the table and leave the room, and the tinnitus would actually remain in the room. At the moment, there has been a trial undertaken here, and it seems that this treatment is as good as normal cognitive behavioural therapy, but over a shorter period of time, but it does not change the underlying perception of the tinnitus sound. It helps the individual adapt from a cognitive perspective to realise what tinnitus actually is. So I thought I'd just summarise, take the last slide. These are my interests in the tinnitus area. We use a number of different techniques, human EEG, fMRI. I have done a little bit of animal work, but I'm no longer doing that. We have been using drugs to try and boost the effects of sound stimulation. For example, a little bit like the vagus nerve stimulation, we've actually completed a trial where we're using MDMA, which is ecstasy. And we've used a dose response to try and evaluate its effect on tinnitus. We're using that drug because spontaneously we had numbers of people coming to the clinic saying, I shouldn't really tell you this, and I don't normally do this, I'm not this sort of person, but I took a tab of ecstasy the other night and my tinnitus just went, and it only came back a couple of days. And I've done it again just to see, and it's happened again. And you go online to use the forums, and while it's not entirely consistent, there does seem to be a pattern around that. Our initial behavioural results don't show a behavioural effect of placebo, but boy is the resting state MRI really interesting. All right, and it shows all sorts of different changes within the brain occurring following NMDA. So that's a little summary of where I'm going. And as I mentioned, essentially for me to be able to undertake these activities, I need to engage with engineers. Some of that is within the commercial sphere and linkages to hearing aid companies or audio companies, but I'm very limited in my ability to engineer solutions themselves. Where I am active is in the interface, particularly in the clinical interface with patients, and then trying to use technology either to assess or treat tinnitus. So those are some of the associations that I have and some of the various funders that are currently funding work in our lab. So thank you very much. So yeah, some questions?
You seem to see an effect with the Tetris control as well as your gains.
Yep.
Is that real, or is that just a...
Well, that's a difficult one for us to assess, given that we use Tetris as the control. We use Tetris as the control because it seems to be a popular control in gains for health interventions. It's seen as something that is fairly, I suppose, not necessarily engaging with the presumed mechanisms of effect. But what people will often say is that tinnitus was there, but it wasn't really a problem until I retired. When I'm really busy, I don't really notice it. And so in some respect, that effect with Tetris is probably real, and it affects cognitive load. A low cognitive load, but enough to actually disrupt it. And I think that what we can't tell is whether the mechanism of conditioned reinforcement and so on is really the mechanism effect of the treatment game, or it's simply because the person has been given the context that this helps tinnitus, plus they've been given a cognitively demanding task to undertake. So it's difficult to say this. So the Tetris effect may in fact be real.
Grant, just you made the point that the tone of the tinnitus was somehow linked, perhaps loosely, to the roll-off of the hearing loss and frequency range. What happens when you have sudden auditory damage, does it?
Yeah, well, this is a really interesting thing, because if we look at the signing deaf, right, so those who have been deaf probably from birth don't hear about tinnitus at all. Now, is that because they don't experience it, or because they can't interpret what that is? For people that have a sudden sensory neural hearing loss, tinnitus is often an accompaniment, even if they go totally deaf. So the speed of onset has been suggested as perhaps a precursor. So, for example, with acoustic trauma that is very abrupt, as opposed to lifelong exposure from working in a noisy factory.
Do those people have a lower frequency tone? Or?
When there is a sudden hearing loss, the complexity of the signal, there's a great variation.
Right.
And that probably also reflects the less punctate injury within the inner ear as well. Typically, the broader the hearing loss, the more noise-like the sound becomes.
Yeah.
So you might expect that if a person had a total hearing loss, that they might hear a sort of a white noise phenomenon opposed to a narrow injury where people tend to hear tonal stimuli. So there is a progression and there is a trend for the tinnitus pitch to relate to the area of hearing loss. And if that's very narrow, and the person hears a narrow band sound, and as it becomes broader, they hear a broader band sound. But it's not always the case. There are always exceptions to the rule as well, which makes the whole thing very frustrating to study, because there is no exact science to this in many ways.
I find it kind of intriguing that almost any intervention that you try is effective, but not for very long. And it somehow seems to me that there's some kind of information in that. And I guess maybe that's where you were saying tinnitus is a bit like experiencing pain, be it phantom pain or anything else, that you can make it go away by thinking pure thoughts or something.
It's almost, a running joke that when a new presentation is at a conference, there'll be 30% that have an effect, 30% that don't have effect, and 30% that have a negative effect of different treatments. One potential concept that we've been working on theoretically is what's called adaptation level theory. And this is essentially based on contrasts and recent memory. So what we consider, is, to give an example, if you're a animal trainer and you work with chihuahuas, then a golden retriever seems very big. Right? If you work with elephants, golden retriever seems very small, and that's based on what your experience is and a sense of relative intensity. And it's the same thing with, a hand in a bucket of cold ice, pulling it out and putting it on a lukewarm surface, as opposed to taking it from a lukewarm surface and putting it on another. We perceive these things relatively. And the concept is that we have a very unusual relationship with adaptation to tinnitus, and that some of these therapies, particularly sound ones, essentially we adapt to the treatment stimulus. So it's effective for a period of time as long as that contrast is disrupted. But if the brain essentially adapts to the sound quicker than it adapts to the tinnitus, then the tinnitus emerges and there's a problem there. So relative perception of intensity is one possible explanation for why there's a common effect. Very strong placebo effect, and clinically, if people receive a placebo effect, we're all for it. That's fine, but it does make the researching of effects very difficult.
So when the tinnitus comes back after treatment, do people notice that it's different in any way, or is it the same as before?
There's a lot of variation, and more often than not, it will resemble what it was before, and is that a memory of what they experienced, or is it actual sound? Some tinnitus treatments, particularly those that are tonal based, are trying to disrupt the pitch maps within the brain, and one would expect that if they were to have an effect, then the tonality of the tinnitus would actually change. But as far as I'm aware, there are no consistent patterns in change there.
So it was intriguing to me to hear that some people have a very strong localization. You can imagine that if that was sort of based on damage to the ear, then that would indicate that there is a constant sort of phase lag, or not a phase lag, a time lag, between the two stimuli, which would seem to me to be...
It seems to me quite sensible in many ways. Were you thinking that's a...
Well, I'm just would be amazed that there would be such a constant effect. You'd effectively have to have some damage that would result in a constant time lag. Alternatively, is it something that is occurring at a higher level that
the way that I interpret this is it actually is not the signal, but once it's established, it's not the signal from the ear, that there is a change in those centres that are coding localisation. And one of the things that I've proposed is sort of, I suppose, one of the drivers for doing some of the head movement work is the concept that, why is it the somatosensory system is having an effect on tinnitus when that's an auditory sensation? Why is the visual system? And of course, when we use our head to localise sound, we're actually using all these systems. And so it's possible that there is a series of common phenomenon there, that when there is peripheral deafferentation, because the connections exist, then you can have a situation where somatosensory stimulation can result in a auditory sensation where it might be there as a noise cancelling system. So when we move our head around, we don't hear strange sounds, where we sort of have a continuous perception of where sound is. And that system is in a nice balance, but with the peripheral auditory injury, that maybe goes out of whack, and that's why somatosensory or visual input can result in the changes in tinnitus as well. It's just a hypothesis, but there does seem to be this overlap in systems.
Just on that, do people with tinnitus have a deficit in vertical sound localisation or front to back discrimination?
Yeah, not all, but as a group, they do. So their localisation ability is disrupted. One of the difficult things with tinnitus, were many things, but three confounding factors: making sure the hearing loss is matched and finding individuals that have hearing loss but do not have tinnitus, so that you actually have a reasonable control there, so you're just not measuring the effects of hearing loss. And the other thing is hyperacusis, or a collapse of loudness perception, because what can occur alongside tinnitus and alongside hearing loss is essentially people will perceive what is a moderately loud sound as uncomfortably loud. And so there's a couple of things that can occur at the same time, and makes pulling apart particularly the objective measures, the MRI and so on, trying to identify what are you actually measuring. Are these differences because of a hearing loss? Are they because of increased sound sensitivity, or are they actually due to the tinnitus itself? Yeah. So as far as whether it's horizontal or vertical, where the deficits are, certainly I know it's in the horizontal. I'm not sure about the vertical deficit.
So the high frequency is more involved in the vertical, isn't it?
Yeah.
The other thing I was wondering, with the disconnection with the visual system, if the hearing system isn't mapping the visual system, you might kind of separate those as well, and if you're not localising sound in the same way that the visual system is.
Yeah, and we like to sort of think of audition this is what audiologists always say, audition is better than vision because you can hear around corners, right? And vision you can't do. It's sort of like the super sense of audition. That's our super sense that we have. You can hear around corners, but it's generally considered that audition is an alerting sense and vision is confirmatory. You know, that you go looking for what caused that sound, and if you can't identify visually what the auditory object was that was causing it, then there is a disconnect between what we normally experience. And in some way, either just at a reaction or emotional level, that will cause annoyance or disruption, but there may actually be plastic changes occurring that are essentially rewiring some of these aspects.
Right, the correlations to pain and the analogy to pain, I think, is an interesting one. In patients who have some sort of pain that's due to mechanical sensation, say for example some noxious stimuli, can sometimes have an acute onset, but then it becomes chronic after that. Do you see the same thing also?
Yeah.
Where you have
Yeah,
acute
and
chronic
it
pain?
seems that there are animal models that have tried to understand this, particularly about the basis. Well, it seems like all the injuries are occurring to the inner ear, but then after a period of time, if you disconnect the inner ear, the person, well, animals still have tinnitus. So there appears to be around about a 12-week window where potentially, if you provided neurotransmitter antagonists, you might be able to prevent tinnitus, but after 12 weeks it becomes established, and because of some form of plasticity beyond the cochlear, that it becomes established here. So it seems to be a 12-week critical period. And for most people, they won't complain about tinnitus. They'll leave it because they believe it's just going to go away, because often tinnitus does. You know, where there's nightclub tinnitus, which lasts 24 hours, and then everything's back to normal. So when a person experiences tinnitus, they're not going to generally go and see anybody, you know, for 6 months, for 12 months. So the vast majority of people that we see in the clinic, you know, probably 99% have had tinnitus for 1, 2, you know, up to 20 years before they're actually doing anything about it. So there probably is a critical period of action. And I think the only group that probably offers an opportunity to actually explore that is the group with a sudden hearing loss, because those are the people that have it and then actually end up in hospital, whereas other people just generally come on.
So we'll call proceedings to a halt then, and let's thank Grant once again.
Thank you.
And please join us for some refreshments.